The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig. On the 21st of February 1942, Stefan Zweig dispatched the manuscript of The World of Yesterday to his publishers. The next day he took his own life in Petrópolis, Brazil. Even today, when I say the word summer, I instinctively think of those July days in Barton. When was a summer more delightful? 1914, when the world was young. I am sitting in a park in that sunlit town, enwrapped in a book. I can almost see the pages. A happy crowd walks around to the sound of music. June 29th, a feast day. Soon it will be holiday time for them. They look forward to relaxing in their cream-colored clothes. Thinking of their anticipation pleases me. So does my reading amidst the sound of birdsong from the trees and music from the park. The book is Merezhkovsky's Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. It is good. I love the world more than ever with its promise of an even greater future. Then the music stopped. I look up. A change has come over the sauntering crowd. They too have stopped. The musicians begin leaving the bandstand without finishing on a feast day in Austria. Something has happened. I approach the bandstand. Excited groups crowd around a pinned notice. Its news passes from mouth to mouth. It is a telegram announcing that the heir to the throne, His Imperial Highness Franz Ferdinand, has been assassinated in Sarajevo. I remember another day in early childhood, the news that Crown Prince Rudolf had been shot dead at Meierling. Through a 7-year-old's eyes, I felt the turmoil of the city, the outpouring of emotion. And yet now 2 hours later, there is no sign of grief, nor even shock. Musicians are playing in the cafes, people are talking, people are laughing. I had never seen Franz Ferdinand smile. It was common knowledge he was friendless and that the old emperor disliked him. This death did not arouse much sympathy. Archduke Karl, the new heir, was far more popular. The dead man had no sense of humor and no feeling for music. It was left to the newspapers to express the appropriate reaction. What gripped the nation was not what should be done in the Balkans, but where the dead couple should be buried. Franz Ferdinand would normally be buried in the imperial vault, but his wife was only a countess. As in life, the archduchesses had slighted her. Now in death they conspired. It was a tremendous intrigue. They petitioned the old emperor. How could he allow a mere countess the full royal burial? All Vienna was intrigued. A story was invented that Franz Ferdinand wished to be buried in the town of Artstetten, which ended the quarrels. Vienna was deprived its grand spectacle and was already beginning to forget the incident. Another few weeks, and the name of Franz Ferdinand would have disappeared forever. Then a week later, the Serbian government was accused of collusion in the killing. The newspapers insinuated Austria could not let the murder of its allegedly beloved heir pass without repercussions. The press was eager for action. Still, we did not think of war. There was skirmishing in the Balkans all the time. Hadn't it all begun with a trade dispute over Serbian pigs? What did it really have to do with us? My bags were packed for Belgium to visit Verhaeren. I remember walking through vineyards on my last day in Barton and an old man in blue vintner's overalls approaching me. What a great vintage we can expect. We've not had weather like this for as long as I remember. Folks will toast this summer for many a year. You think I'm talking symbolically about those summer days? Taste a bottle from that vintage and tell me life cannot be symbolic. It may be difficult to understand our optimism and confidence. When I arrived in Belgium, a little seaside resort near Ostend, the mood matched mine. Holidaymakers lay on the beach in brightly colored tents. Children flew kites, people danced on the promenade. Europe had never been stronger or wealthier. Progress was everywhere. War was a distant, outmoded phenomenon spoken of by hairy old men, veterans of 1866. A time before telephones, aeroplanes, machine guns. Now, with the exception of Russia, we had a free press, a channel for the anti-war leanings of the people. There were powerful unions and socialist organizations whose actions were hard to predict. Leaders could not be sure if they declared war whether men would mobilize or strike. It was unthinkable they would choose to find out. Years of peace had strengthened the economy. Technology sped the pace of life. Scientific discoveries fell over one another. Cities grew more attractive and more populated. Whenever you came back to one, you were delighted to see streets broader, buildings taller, shop fronts more elegant. Everything conveyed a sense of growth. Fashions became more natural, people younger and healthier. It seemed the more ambitious your enterprise, the more likely it was to succeed. To dare was to win. When Blériot made the first cross-channel flight, we rejoiced in Vienna as if he was one of our own. Pride in the triumphs of progress built a sense of European identity. How pointless, we said, were the old frontiers if it was child's play to cross them from above. How antiquated and contrary to the spirit of our time. Foreign travel became cheaper and travelers more adventurous. To be anxious was to be old-fashioned. The world was spinning, and we were at its center. On that beach, all imaginable nations gathered convivially. A great deal of German was spoken, visitors from the Rhineland, which was newly nearby. The mood was broken only by newsboys hawking their wares of the Paris papers. Austria challenges Russia, they would cry. Germany prepares to mobilize. You could see people's faces darken as they read the reports, but only briefly. Half an hour later, the same people would be splashing in the water, spluttering happily. We had had these diplomatic conflicts before, and they were always settled before anything serious happened. Seagulls flew overhead, and the sun shone down. But bad news kept coming and grew more threatening. First, there was Austria's ultimatum to Serbia, the evasive answer to it, telegrams exchanged by monarchs. And finally, the news that could no longer be concealed. Mobilization. The hotels were still full, the beaches, the cafes, but a new note was struck when Belgian soldiers began being seen. I remember sitting at a cafe with local friends. Surreal as it sounds, the army was transporting machine guns on little carts harnessed to dogs. In defiance of the changing mood, one of us stood up and patted the nearest dog. This got the attention of the escorting officer. His expression implied this petting of war material detracted from his dignity. Another of us murmured, "Why all this stupid marching about?" "Precautions have to be taken," was the firm reply. Years ago, word had gone round here that in the event of war between Germany and France, the German generals planned to advance through Belgium. Ridiculous, I hear myself say once again with such conviction, thinking of the Germans enjoying their hospitality, believing treaties were sacred. If the Germans march in, I'll hang myself from that lamppost. But then came those critical days in late July when news broke not by the day but by the hour. Telegrams and telegrams. The assassination of Jaurès. My Austria declared war on Serbia. A cold wind of fear blew through the beach, sweeping it clear. Even the most confident began packing. Finally, I bought a railway ticket for the Ostend Express. We stood in its corridors agitated and impatient. No one could sit still or concentrate. We rushed out at every station for the latest news. We still did not believe in war. Somewhere there must be new news, different news. There is always a strong desire to go on hoping. We passed Verviers, the Belgian border station, and German conductors boarded. In 10 minutes we would be in Germany. But halfway to Heberstadt the train stopped. We crowded the windows. Then in the darkness coming towards us came freight train after freight train. Open trucks covered by tarpaulin could not quite conceal the shape of cannon. My heart missed a beat. The German vanguard was invading Belgium. There was no more room for doubt on that train going the other direction, the last that would reach Germany. This was war. I never considered myself important enough that I would tell the story of my life. I did not arrange my life to be in position as a witness. Instead, I have witnessed more than I would have chosen. When I read the history I lived, I realize how much easier it is to recite what happened than to recall the psychological undertow. Old men forget. Young people can't know what they don't know. So I must try to remember, to read the ink, now almost invisible, without my papers or my friends to guide me. I remember a day in earliest youth when our old cook burst into the sitting room with tears in her eyes. She had just heard of the death of Charlotte Walter, the star actress of the Burgtheater. It is peculiar to recall that for all her grief she had never once been to the distinguished theatre, nor seen Charlotte Walter perform. Such was the atmosphere in the city. People still spoke of when the old Burgtheater was demolished, the building in which Mozart himself held court. When the final curtain fell, everyone raced on stage to take home as little as a splinter from the boards. Decades later in many homes, these relics remained in precious caskets. Exaggeration, you will think. No. Vienna. In my generation, we lost the Bösendorfer room. That little concert hall, home only to chamber music, looked modest, not suggesting great distinction. Originally Prince Liechtenstein's writing school, it had been cheaply adapted for musical purposes without ostentation. And yet it had the resonance of an old violin. Many of the famous quartets had first performed in this room. Brahms and Rubinstein had given recitals, Liszt and Chopin before them. It was a sacred place for music lovers. And now it was to make way for a new hall. For us who had spent so many memorable hours here, such a development was beyond our understanding. We were not rational on that last night of the Bösendorfer room. When the final bars of Beethoven died away, played better than ever by the Rose Quartet, none of the audience left their seats. We shouted and applauded, some sobbing with emotion. No one was willing to admit this was goodbye. In time the lights were extinguished to usher us out. Still none of the 400 gave way. We stayed for half an hour, maybe an hour, as if a vigil could save the blessed room. This did not work. Whenever one of these historic buildings fell, it felt like a part of our souls was being torn away. It was not difficult to make fun of our theatrical mania as the German economy next door powered ahead. Vienna and Berlin still ran by different rules. I remember my first talkative landlady as a student. She did not keep the place sparkling, but was cheerful. Even if you pointed out she had again forgotten to do something. When I spent a semester in Berlin, everything was immaculate. The landlady fulfilled any little request so quickly you ran out of them. I thought how wonderful efficiency is. Then I received her monthly bill. 3 pfennigs for sewing a button, 20 for removing ink from a tablecloth, 67 in all. To know where I stood, I had to start my own ledger, like a real Prussian. The genius of old Vienna was that it harmonized cultures. Our culture was a synthesis of Europe. We indulged ourselves, ate well, enjoyed parties and the theatre. We made excellent music as often as possible. Perhaps we overrated pleasure. The Germans looked down on us with scorn, we who forewent seriousness. Scorn tinged, I think, with something else. Instead of pursuing efficiency, we lived with hearts and minds at ease by the Danube. There were few situations so serious we didn't lighten them with a quip. This was our spirit of jouissance. I must still defend it. The good things in life exist, so everyone can enjoy them. It is a supreme right to live freely without anxieties and with security. I suppose what a boy in short trousers breathes into his bloodstream stays with him. Against all that is now drummed daily in my ears, I look for comfort to the ancient constellations that shone in my childhood. I still cannot quite deny the belief that in spite of everything, events will take a turn for the better. Live and let live. Live and let live. A Viennese maxim that still seems more humane to me than any categorical imperative. It reigns supreme. Poor and rich, Czechs and Germans, Christians and Jews lived peacefully together. There were little needling remarks, but we felt free of narrow-minded prejudice. Even when Luger became mayor, leader of the anti-Semitic party, our relationships were unaffected. Freedom in your private life was taken for granted. Toleration was not yet deplored as weakness. I personally never felt the slightest coldness for me as a Jew. I was born in the empire of the Habsburg monarchy in 1881. You would look for it in vain on the map today. While attitudes in politics and morality were easygoing, no leniency was shown in artistic matters. Here the honor of the city was at stake. Artistic achievement, being prized and rewarded for centuries, led to exceptional expertise. It was wonderful to be a darling of the public. The richest magnate, even a prime minister, could walk through the streets of Vienna and not raise a stare. But an actor or operatic diva turned heads in unison. To maintain that position, you must give your best, constantly. Every wrong note was detected, and not only by critics. The whole city absorbed a sense of rhythm as if from the air. This veneration for culture coincided with a decline in power and might, but I do not know which came first. Other countries expanded their borders. Ours was an empire of music. This musicality expressed itself amongst writers in the particular attention we paid to well-turned prose. Our Bible was a feuilleton section of the Neue Freie Presse newspaper. Can you believe these essays of culture criticism appeared on the front page, under a line to keep them distinct from ephemera like politics and news? There was less news then, and every one of these essays was the talk of the town. An author must prove sound judgment and exact form to be admitted to this sanctuary. At the theatre and other festivities, we all came together. Even the lives of the poorest showed a feeling for beauty drawn from the surrounding landscape, the genial human values. The floral parade saw 300,000 heartily greet the upper 10,000 in their beautifully decorated carriages. Everything in Vienna was an occasion for festivities of music and color. Religious spectacles like the Corpus Christi procession, military parades, even funerals. It was an ambition to end up as a handsome corpse with a fine funeral procession, companions escorting you on your final journey. A genuine Viennese wished even his death to be a show for the enjoyment of others. In a cinema today, merriment breaks out when society men and women of 1900 appear on screen in black frock coats and whalebone corsets. How people smile, learning a reference by such a woman to a man's unmentionables meant his trousers. Or how on her wedding night an aunt of mine appeared back at her parents' house, frantically ringing the bell. The most terrible news: she had married a madman. She had only narrowly managed to escape him in his derangement. I believe he had tried to take her clothes off. In their ignorance, girls were more girlish. If a young man greeted them in the street, they would blush. Does anyone still blush? Simply from the way she carried herself, you could tell the difference between a girl and a woman. In that cinema audience, the naive can believe people 40 years ago were biologically different. Perhaps we all like to think our grandparents were. Few today have any idea of the extent of prostitution then. The discrepancy between society's idea of maturity and the body's idea had many consequences. Early marriage was frowned upon. No bourgeois father would allow his daughter to marry a man until he was established, which few reached before 25. And so the pavements were so crowded with women of easy virtue, it was difficult to avoid them. You think this still exists in places today, but it was everywhere then. These girls took a special license from the police to certify her and the regulations. She must attend regular medical examinations. Not, of course, that the police would help her if a difficult customer refused to pay. She was on her own. In a brothel, her wares might fetch a higher price, but she likely became a prisoner of the madame. The most illustrious houses had secret doors and special staircases to ensure discretion for gentlemen of the court. What stories you heard! At the height of society, no modesty or regulation was necessary. As easily as a streetwalker with a license could be bought, so could a ballerina without one, not for 2 crowns, but 200. The great courtesans were society figures. Photographs of them at horse racing appeared in the newspapers, and the most successful procuresses stood outside the law in return for supplying the wants of aristocrats. Men suffered too. Few could look back on their first experiences with women solely with pleasure. I can recall the fearful faces of friends. One whose wallet was stolen in a brothel and dared not report it. Another terrified he was coming down with something. Another who could only afford treatment by asking his father. Or another being blackmailed to pay for an abortion or alimony to a waitress. Cases in which proof was difficult, in which boys from good homes presented opportunities. When their sons came of age, a few imaginative fathers would hire a pretty maid with an understanding. Better to keep this troublesome business under your own roof. The fear of infection cast a shadow over intimate moments. Diseases were more prevalent, much more dangerous. Street signs and adverts for specialists in skin disease were common. This euphemism was an ever-present reminder of venereal disease. Syphilis was still treated by rubbing the body with quicksilver. Among other damage, this made teeth fall out. Even if treatment was successful, you feared the infection would return with the potential for paralysis or brain disease. It was far from unheard of for a man to be diagnosed and then reach for a revolver. Bourgeois young women were free from these problems, if you consider constant supervision to be freedom. Every book they read would be checked. Governesses and chaperones kept them occupied. They were protected from dangerous ideas, unable to step out the front door unescorted. Their danger was not what could happen, but what might not, if by 30 she was still unmarried. Even at 25, she had a problem. To be left on the shelf was a sad fate, made sadder by the laughter about old maids. These women were forced to deny their longing for love to preserve the good name of their family. It is horrifying to think of all the jokes at their expense. How often the society is cruelest to those who embody its deficiencies, its contradictions of nature. You will find little mention of these things in official sources. Even the era's literature rarely references such perils and confusions. Indecent subjects were not mentioned in public, at school, in the family. Science considered such things beneath its dignity. Today I feel as though not 40 but 1,000 years have passed when I see young men and women in companionship, competing in studies and sports. They look genuinely happy. What a revolution has been. You can't know how much more humane streets look without crowds of hungry saleswomen. You were never sure if you hoped they found a customer soon or not. They wandered around offering pleasure, expecting none of their own, knowing the street they would walk before long would be the one to the hospital. I will confess I also harbor envy for today's school children who talk with their teachers naturally, and have greater room for self-expression. Amidst all that old Viennese music, I still remember a simple, artless song we had to learn and sing, a song about happy, blissful childhood days. Even at age 7, I could hardly push out the words. My school career was nothing but tedium, which increased each year with my impatience to escape. School meant compulsion, boredom, learning for the sake of learning. The scholastic material did not seem worth knowing, the material made to seem scholastic, sliced into neat portions. The classrooms would have been better as barracks, whitewashed walls, no ceilings, no pictures or ornamentation. We sat in pairs like convicts on low wooden benches that made us bend our backs. We sat there until our bones ached. The musty odor settled first on your clothes and then on your soul. We were brought up to respect the status quo as perfect. Our teachers' opinions were infallible, state institutions absolute and eternal. It was a cardinal principle that young people should not have it easy. We must learn obedience and understand duty before being granted rights. If we sought enlightenment on the world's problems, we were told, "You wouldn't understand that yet." A private conversation between a teacher and pupil would not happen. It might put us on the same level and diminish their standing. Nothing is more telling of this lack of connection than the fact I have forgotten all my teachers' names and faces. But I remember vividly the lectern with the class register, the little red book we squinted at that contained our marks and ranking. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, my name was not found inside amidst the high flyers. I was not alone in my dislike of school. My friends hated the way our interests were inhibited. By 14 or 15, we felt we had overtaken the curriculum. We moved to the rhythms of Mussorgsky, Debussy, and Schoenberg. Our eyes were dazzled by the Impressionists. Poetry promised a new form of the sublime. Verlaine, Rimbaud, Mallarmé. Enthusiasm is contagious amongst young people, but there is an element of chance in what spreads. Behind us was a whole class fixated with football. The class ahead were devoted to Tolstoy and socialism. The fact I was in a year with others captivated by the arts may have decided my career. Young people, like certain animals, have an excellent instinct for changes in the weather. The artistic ideas of the old century were coming to an end. In embryo was a change in values, perhaps a revolution. We all looked for talent in ourselves and tried to develop it. 4 or 5 wanted to be actors, declaiming everywhere in the style of the Berghof. 2 or 3 were well-trained musicians, deciding if they would be a composer, conductor, or virtuoso. One boy, the son of a society painter, would sketch us future geniuses. But the strongest trend was towards literary endeavor, inspired by the youthful examples of Rilke and Hofmannsthal. I remember an obsession for a new play by Gerhard Hauptmann. Even before rehearsals began, we were approaching actors rumored to have parts to discover, ahead of the newspapers, the exact cast and plot. We got expensive haircuts from the theatre barber, even if our hair was short, just to glean a secret about Sonnenthal. A boy in the lower class found himself besieged by our friendly fraternity. His uncle was the lighting inspector, and we hoped, correctly, he could sneak us into rehearsal. If after the night of the premiere you were unable to discuss every detail, you might as well not come to school. You were nobody. And yet today I'm not sure which Hauptmann play gripped us, and I don't think it was one of his best. If our teachers had been paying attention, they would have found at the back of our exercise books the still unsung poems of Rilke, or that in another lecture on Schiller we were reading Nietzsche under the table. The masters had never heard of him. It seemed they had hardly read a thing since university. They might have noticed a pattern that explained why some afternoons 2/3 of their pupils suddenly fell ill. It was a premiere, and we were queuing for the standing room places. We went to all the art exhibitions, we plundered second-hand bookshops, we crowded into university lectures. But our best source for what was nascent was the coffee house. This was a Viennese institution. It felt like a club, except anyone could join for the price of a cheap coffee. In return, you could sit talking, playing cards, receiving mail, and best of all, reading journals from all over. We read for hours, and nothing escaped us. I realize now the absurdity of our precociousness, how much it was merely mimicry. If we were discussing Nietzsche, someone would say with a superior air, "But of course on the subject of egotism, Kierkegaard is better." We would nod sagely. Inside we were panicking. He knows about Kierkegaard and I don't. At the first opportunity I would race to the library to request the work of a Danish philosopher I could not spell. I never again read as much as Osius. I wonder where I found the time. We devoured what was new because we wanted something that belonged to us, not the world of our fathers. At 13, when this craze started, I stopped ice skating. Every penny went on theatre, concerts, and books. By 18, I still couldn't swim, dance, or play tennis. On the most beautiful summer days when everyone was outdoors. All the better for us indoors at the coffee house. Eventually, there was the one moment of elation for which I thanked my school, the day its doors closed behind me for the last time. It had long been decided I was to study at a university. My brother had joined my father's business. As the second son, I had greater freedom. My parents did not mind what I studied so long as I gained a degree. I was committed to literature, but I already had a distrust of academics. In practice, I find that second-hand booksellers often know more about their books than the professors who theorize on them. The real choice was not which curriculum would interest me the most, but which would burden me the least. I finally chose philosophy. At the time it was called exact philosophy. Inexact philosophy was not offered. That would seem all the more unfortunate once I grasped I have little aptitude for abstract thought. A problem for another day. I drew up a plan for my time. For 3 years I would not bother with university studies. Then in the 4th year I would fire up, dash off a dissertation, and master the material in time for examinations. I can think of few happier times than the beginning of my studies. In the first term I called into the university on 2 occasions, once at the beginning to register for lectures, then again at the end to certify my attendance. I discovered there were 24 hours in a day, and all of them mine. To a 19-year-old, 3 years sounds almost like an eternity. How at such an age I found the courage to submit an essay to the Neue Freie Presse, the newspaper regarded as the oracle, is more than I can understand. Not even a submission to the cultural pages, but to the feuilleton itself. I suppose I thought nothing worse than rejection could happen to me. How bad could that be? This was the thinking of someone yet to experience rejection from a coveted authority. The editor of the feuilleton was Theodor Herzl, and he received would-be essayists once a week. With a regular cycle of famous contributors, there was seldom room for an outsider. One week, with my heart racing, I climbed a little spiral staircase to submit my name. A few minutes later, a secretary came to me. He would see me now. I entered a small, cramped room. There was Herzl, looking regal with his black morning coat and melancholy, deep blue eyes. After a brief but deliberate pause, he shook my hand warmly. Opposite his theatrical greeting, I felt like an understudy on a Burgtheater stage who has forgotten his lines. He indicated for us to sit and said, "I think I've heard your name somewhere. Do you write poetry?" I said I did. He leant back. "Well, what have you brought me?" I said I would very much like to submit a little essay and handed it to him. I expected that to be the end of it. To my surprise, he leant further back and began to read my words. I tried in vain to intuit his opinion. He read slowly, turning the pages without looking up. The experience was as if there in front of my eyes my soul was being weighed, measured, and judged. When he finished, he folded it, carefully put it in an envelope, then wrote something on it, all without looking at me. Only then did he raise his glance, saying with solemnity, "I am glad to accept your fine piece for publication in the feuilleton." To me it was like Napoleon on the battlefield presenting a young sergeant with the Legion d'Honneur. My family had little to do with literature and tolerated my writing as a harmless diversion, so much better than playing cards or chasing disreputable girls. Now imagine my father in his winged collar eating breakfast, glancing at the front page of the newspaper. Staring back at him is the name of that unkempt student sitting across, the student who had hardly won the acclaim of his teachers, whose opinions were not much valued at this table. Of course, Stefan is a common name, but Zweig is not. But the feuilleton is the highest authority. Its writers demand respect. Don't some of these opinions seem a little familiar? Could the boy have published his own newspaper? It looks very much like the Neue Freie Presse. From where would he have found all this news? Anything the matter, father? I imagine he thought his eyes were deceiving him in the early morning. At the nearest tobacconist he would find the same configuration of ink. Just as inexplicably that unusual surname continued appearing on the front page, almost on a regular basis. You would not believe the change within my family. I could have written something the equal of Keats, Goethe, or Shelley without the same effect. Now my parents would come with me to the theatre to show me off to their friends, a puzzling experience for all parties. For the first time I was something more than insurance against accident or injury to my brother. Even if I did write poetry, it gave me unexpected confidence. Perhaps my extracurricular studies had not been in vain. I asked permission to study a semester in Berlin, a request that recently would have seemed outré. I could not be refused in the golden aura of the feuilleton. So I went to Berlin and made a landlady rich. Too quickly I was back in Vienna. Much too quickly I had to face the spoken examination. There were a few topics I could steer the conversation towards to be on solid ground. There was one topic I must avoid as much as possible: exact philosophy. Thankfully, the kindly professor knew me from my literary activity more than I knew him from his lectures. I remember my joy when he said, "I expect you'd rather not be tested in the field of logic." Perhaps it was logical to him that a literary person would not like logic in a way it had not been to me. I agreed to his suggestion in a way I hoped implied I could in fact speak logic. I passed the exam. For the first time I was a free man. All the years since I've given to the struggle to stay free, at least in my mind, a struggle that becomes ever harder. I had promised myself I would use this freedom to live in Paris, the city of eternal youth. I was so familiar with it from Balzac, Zola, Charles Louis Philippe. Seeing it was a case of recognition, the anagnosis Aristotle praises as the greatest artistic pleasure. I cannot imagine a city better blessed with the ability to make people happy. You could buy a steak with red wine for a few sous, you could dress as you liked. A young couple would start dancing in the street, a policeman would smile. The street was common property. The inheritance of the revolution still coursed through the city. Workers in shirt sleeves promenaded down the most expensive streets. Anyone could walk into the finest auction rooms to see masterpieces change hands. If you stood still on any street and listened, there was laughter somewhere. I came to know many writers and artists. There was great respect for intellectuals. Writers who could not earn a living were found jobs which did not require much work. They would be librarians in the Naval Ministry or the Senate, sitting in comfort in elegant palaces looking out on the Jardin du Luxembourg, writing, thinking. Very occasionally an admiral might request a book. They were happy with a little money and time spent in search of the sublime. Impressionist painters whose work can sell for thousands lived much the same, in modest houses with a little studio. When I think of Paris, I think of Rainer Maria Rilke. I knew him best there, how he loved Paris. He lived as mysterious a life as any poet, always on the move. Not even he knew where he would be ahead of time. He could enter a room without being noticed, yet his restraint exerted influence. Every movement, every gesture was gentle. When you amused him, he would hint at laughter. Many can louden a room with their presence. Rilke could quieten. You found after a long conversation you became incapable of vulgarity for hours, even days. In renouncing the ephemeral, Rilke made not only his poetry but his life into art. I felt almost ashamed to look at him, this monastic man who gave so much of himself for so little acclaim. His fundamental sense of beauty was applied to everything. Even if he lacked funds, he dressed with utmost care and taste. I once saw him pack his suitcase like he was crafting a mosaic, everything in its own place. There are florists who work less deftly. He wrote his manuscripts on the finest paper, each line of his calligraphic handwriting perfectly aligned. He took the same care with the least important letter. He never crossed out a word. If he had expressed himself inexactly, he would rewrite the whole thing with utmost patience. Nothing less than perfect left his hands. I am thankful Rilke was spared the sight of that city's saddest hour. Few of my own misfortunes have distressed me like its humiliation. Today it is tainted by tanks, swastikas, and jackboots. Perhaps it will never recover its natural ease. There are moments when I wonder if after our time of destruction there can ever be another Rilke, a pure poet devoted to lyrical form. Then I think of Goethe's words after Byron's death. The earth will bring them forth as she brought them forth before. You would expect I would find it inspiring to be amongst such people, who cared not what the newspapers were celebrating this week, servants and guardians of language interested in what would endure. Exactly the opposite. My confidence drained away. I couldn't understand how I had summoned the courage to publish poetry. Who was I compared to a force like Rilke, a man who could alter the temperature of a room? I still thought my verses craftsmanlike, even skillful, demonstrating a passion for language. But they were written in ignorance of life. They employed the techniques of others at second hand. Following the advice of Diemel, to whom I am grateful, I began translating from foreign languages. I still regard this as the best way for a young writer to gain a deeper understanding of his own tongue. I began with Baudelaire, Keats, William Morris. I do not know if the name of Emile Verhaeren still means anything. To me it means a great deal. I was fascinated by his poetry because he showed a new way. Other writers saw machines as evil, cities as ugly, the present as unpoetic. Verhaeren loved the modern world and wanted to conquer it for literature. He was still unknown in Germany, where critics much later still confused him with Verlaine. It felt like I had discovered him myself, and that doubles one's affection. When I finally met him, that affection only multiplied. He had confidence without conceit. His enthusiasm for new discoveries and life itself inspired your will to live. His best poems will long bear witness to the Europe of that time and the kind of humanity we dreamt of then. I devoted 3 years to translating his poetry and drama. This unappreciated work calls for care and patience, virtues I had avoided in education. It became dear to me. In this modest activity I felt for the first time I was doing something to justify my existence. I was now clear about my path for the next few years. I would see and learn a great deal, and only then would I really begin. I abandoned my hopes of matching the precocious success of Hofmannsthal. First, I needed to know what the world was about. One day at Verhaeren's, an art historian was lamenting that the days of the great sculptors were over. I strongly disagreed. Wasn't Rodin still alive? My passions rose as I spoke of him at length. Verhaeren was smiling, and when I finished, said, "A man who loves Rodin so much ought to meet him. I'm visiting his studio tomorrow. If you don't mind, I'll take you with me." If I didn't mind? That night I did not sleep. After such anticipation, when I met him, my voice dried up. He talked with Verhaeren. I couldn't say a word, stood among his work like another statue. I knew Rodin must think me idiotic. The moments passed, it seemed there was nothing I could do to rouse myself. Before I knew it, we were leaving, but then the old man asked me to lunch in Meudon, where he had his real studio. It was as if he had been charmed by my awkwardness. There was a lesson I had yet to learn. Great men are always the kindliest. That day we went over to the studio. It was a huge room full of replicas of his most important work, but among them lay hundreds of delightful little studies, usually just in plaster: a hand, a horse's mane, a woman's ear. I can still imagine many of these practice pieces. Finally the master led me to a plinth on which his latest work was hidden. With his furrowed hands he removed the damp cloths and stepped back. Instinctively I cried, "Admirable." I was immediately ashamed of saying something so banal. But with objectivity and no vanity he murmured in agreement, "N'est-ce pas?" Then he hesitated. Except there by the shoulder, just a moment. He took off his jacket, put on a white coat, picked up a spatula, and with a master's touch smoothed the shoulder of soft feminine skin. It seemed to come alive. Once again he stepped back. "Here too," he murmured. Yet again a tiny detail enhanced the effect. Then he said no more. He stepped forward, stepped back, looked at the figure's reflection in a mirror, almost growled. His eyes, full of friendly abstraction at the lunch table, flashed with strange light. He began working with all the passion and power of his heavy body. He had grown taller and younger. The floorboards creaked. I stood behind, as quiet as possible, enchanted to watch this great master. He worked faster and faster. A wildness took over. His movements became more and more decisive. He was transfixed by the creation in front of him, and beyond it, unseen, his vision of absolute perfection. This went on for a quarter of an hour, half an hour, I couldn't tell you how long. Such moments are outside time. Then his hands slowed. They seemed to understand there was no more for them to do. Once, twice, 3 times he stepped back to look, without making more changes. Then he murmured something, and with the ardor you place a shawl around a woman you love, he replaced the cloths. He took a deep breath. Tension released. He looked heavy. The fire was out. Then came the great lesson for me, something I could hardly grasp. He took off the white coat, put his jacket on again, and turned to go. As he was about to open the door, he saw me and looked at me with surprise, almost anger, as if I was an intruder. Where his mind had been, it was entirely superfluous to know he had brought a young man to the studio today, as was the identity of that man. Despite its recency, the knowledge had left him. But next moment he remembered and came towards me as if ashamed. "Pardon, monsieur," he began. I was beyond speech. I gratefully took his hand. I could have kissed him. In that hour the eternal secret of all great art opened to me, indeed of earthly achievement. The unification of all a man's powers and senses, a state of being outside himself, outside the world. I learned a lesson to last a lifetime. I could only wonder if I would ever sculpt prose with the same command. I had a premonition of what was to come, visiting the Loire Valley and the grave of Balzac. I stopped to see a film show in the sleepy town of Tours. It was a small cinema, just a hall, not at all like the modern palaces of Chrome. Inside was a crowd of labourers, soldiers, market women, ordinary French people who defied the no-smoking sign, blowing Scaffaletti tobacco into rich clouds as they chatted away. First on the screen came a reel titled News of the World, a military parade, and the people talked and laughed. A boat race in England. Again they took little notice. Suddenly I was home again as I saw the platform of the Westbahnhof in Vienna, and Austrian policemen standing on ceremony. The Emperor Franz Joseph appeared, stooping, unsteady on his feet as he passed the guard of honor. The audience in Tours smiled sympathetically at the grand old gentleman with white side whiskers. Then a train came into view, carriage by painted carriage. The door of the saloon car opened. Out stepped, in the uniform of a general, his moustache bristling, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The kindly people of Tours went out of their minds. Men shouted and stamped, women whistled, children jeered. You would think they had each been personally insulted. Then the pictures changed, and soon they were laughing heartily. That storm of rage lasted seconds, perhaps a single second, but my evening was ruined. This was not Paris, where worldly people followed diplomatic news. Seeing how deep hatred ran here in the provinces made me shudder. I told the story of this to many friends. They didn't take it seriously. You don't know these people. They don't feel deeply about politics. The novelist Romain Rolland saw it differently. He said the simpler the people, the easier it is to win them over. He said we have entered a time of mass emotion and cannot know its power. I had only witnessed what was coming. Roland understood it. I was 32 years old, but still felt like a novice not ready to commit. Other men were married with children, holding responsible positions. War was something like death, something one knew could happen, but something surely far away. Then it wasn't. I had settled back in Vienna and arrived there on the first morning of war to find the city in a fever. Parades took over the streets, military music and banners filled the air. New recruits found themselves marching in triumph, cheered and applauded for the first time in their lives. The most humble individual saw possibility. He could be a hero. Women were making much of those in uniform. Young men were genuinely afraid they might miss out on this wonderfully exciting event. My first shock of this war nobody had wanted was everybody's sudden enthusiasm. Even against my better judgment, I found something inspiring in the outburst of feeling. Hundreds of thousands of people suddenly felt they belonged together. The streets were no longer populated by isolated beings, but a united people. In this surge of fraternal feeling, all differences were put aside. Strangers spoke to one another. People were enlivened in this moment of history. They were raised out of ordinary existence by the old magic of banners and patriotic speeches. It must be a curse of our species that only amidst tragedy and adversity do we find such togetherness. The people of Austria believed that if the Emperor Franz Joseph in his 84th year was calling on him to fight, it must be from extreme necessity. These people blindly trusted the authorities. War could only be happening against the will of our statesmen. So all the criminals and warmongers were on the other side. Our actions were self-defense against a malicious enemy. By the third or fourth day, horror stories about the enemy filled the newspapers. Eyes put out, hands cut off, killing in cold blood. Women and children unspared. The worst rumors soon became the official record. People swore that just before the outbreak, they had seen cars laden with gold traveling from France to Russia. Emotionalism was overpowering. Society ladies declared they would never speak another word of French. Foreign businesses were forced to change their names. Shakespeare was exiled from German theatres. Writers felt it their patriotic duty to reinforce the enthusiasm of the masses. They imitated ancient Germanic bards by promoting the glory of war. Scholars questioned if there had ever been such a thing as French or British culture. Philosophers claimed war was an immersion in steel to revive the strength of the nation. Doctors praised a new prosthetic limb so convincingly, you almost considered if you should amputate something for the benefit. Nobody became more emblematic of this madness than Ernst Lissauer. From his succinct and acerbic little poems, it was a surprise to meet him, a stout and friendly man. Even if it was impossible to stop him reciting his work, you couldn't help but like him. No one knew more about German poetry or was more in love with the language. Like many Jews of that time, he made himself more German than the Germans. When war broke out, he hurried to the barracks to volunteer. The recruiting sergeants decided the regiment was not in need of this waddling figure. Devastated by this, he took up his pen instead. He believed everything in the newspapers was gospel truth and the worst villain must be Lord Grey. The result was his hymn of hate for England. It was printed everywhere. School teachers read it to their pupils. Every soldier was handed a copy. His eternal oath never to forgive England for its crime became the most famous poem in Germany, set to music and performed in theatres. But after the war, inevitably his fame degraded into notoriety. People preferred to blame him for the hysteria of hatred than reflect on their own part. He was pilloried as the England hater. Lissauer fell into obscurity. His intense patriotism anticipated the politics of the future, but when it came, it counted for nothing against the accident of his parentage. Amidst this, I too took up the pen. I was surprised when a major German paper agreed to publish my essay titled "To Friends Abroad." Only one edit was made, a reference to if and when someone emerges victorious. It was unprintable to imply there was any doubt who would win. Even this mild article rejecting hatred brought me indignant letters from the ultra-patriotic. About a fortnight later, when I had almost forgotten it, it brought me another with a Swiss postmark and the census stamp. The familiar handwriting told me it was from Roman Roland. After all the betrayals of reason, reading this was one of the happiest moments of my life. It contained an unforgettable sentence. I, for one, will never forsake my friends. Roland maintained his humanity that transcended borders. Roland, who had foreseen so much. I no longer felt alone. This encouraged me to write more articles, to convey the suffering of those at the front and the indifference of those at home. I would describe the plight of an imaginary French infantryman. The censors allowed this, while any thinking person knew the Austrian soldiers had it just the same. I wrote enthusiastic praise for Bertha von Suttner, the founder of the pacifist movement. I came to respect the magnanimity of the Austrian authorities. In 1915, on assignment from the War Archive, I saw things firsthand and discovered my French infantrymen had it easy. My worst fears underestimated the real horror. I traveled in open artillery carriages sitting on field guns, or in cattle trucks where exhausted men slept on top of one another in a stench as if already butchered. In hospital trains with soldiers trying to act as orderlies swaying through the carriages, too tired to walk straight. Others lay on stretchers covered with blood-stained blankets. Amongst the groaning in every carriage was one or two dead. At each station a doctor who was really a dentist from Hungary telegraphed ahead for morphine. It had all gone. He did not even have enough bandages. How different from those bright white hospitals in the newspapers with the pretty nurses. A priest told me he had issued the last rites more in the past month than the rest of his life. I do not forget his words. I am 67 years old. I never thought humanity capable of such a crime. If today, thinking calmly, we wonder why Europe did this, there is not one sensible reason to be found. There were no ideas involved. In the escalation of events, every nation felt that it was strong and forgot the others felt the same. A rush of blood to the head is dangerous and intoxicating. An awareness of one's own power leads nations, just like men, to its misuse. The irresistible dynamism from years of peace had the consequence of bringing war. The tragedy was how our shared optimism betrayed us. For when the diplomats began their game of bluff, everyone was waiting for someone else to back down at the last minute, at the last second. In Tarnow I came across a transport carrying Russian prisoners. The enemy. They sat on the floor smoking and talking, no interest in escaping. The Austrian reservists showed little more interest in guarding them. These middle-aged men sat with the prisoners in a friendly fashion. Both sides were as unkempt as the other. They exchanged cigarettes and laughed. There was much amusement from faltering attempts at communication. One guard was showing photographs of his family to interested questions. They seemed to regard the war as a misfortune that had befallen them which they could do nothing about. Anyone else with the same bad luck was a kind of brother. These simple men saw the war more clearly for what it was than the generals or government ministers. My natural reaction to all dangerous situations is to keep my distance. That had been my preference too when the animal spirits and bloodlust took hold. I had to wonder if all the others had lost their minds or if only I. For which was more likely? My identity as a citizen of the world conflicted with my duty to my country. Now I try to reconcile myself to the shock of seeing the effects of war. But when I opened a Viennese newspaper again, this was not possible. To read about the huge losses suffered by the enemy against our low casualties, our inflexible will to victory against their faltering resolve, the lies of wartime. There was no victory to be had in this carnage. I could not contain my revulsion. Real anger took hold of me. I finally had a powerful urge to really write against what was happening. I did not want to write a pacifist drama expressing a truism that peace is preferable to war. I chose the biblical character of Jeremiah, a prophet issuing warnings in vain. It is the same in any time that most people identify with the winners and seek to share in their glory, even if they themselves are incapable of the necessary sacrifices without even considering if they are capable of them. I wanted to show how power and victory can corrupt the truly victorious, and the spiritual poverty that follows. Why the defeated can have been defeated in spite of their moral superiority, perhaps because of it, and how a man despised as weak and fearful can be the same who ultimately endures. For to be careful is not to be cowardly. To be humane is not to be weak. Writing this, I said everything I could not say in conversation, and I recovered my true self. When I began, in 1915, I could not expect any success from it, as I was going against the spirit of the time. I thought obscurity likely, hostility possible. But when Jeremiah was published in 1917, it quickly sold 20,000 copies, a great number for a published play. Without meaning to, I had anticipated a new mood. Time had done its work. People were looking at war with cooler, harder eyes. We were no longer a small minority, we who hated it, we who wanted it over but could not celebrate a victory. I received permission to travel to Zurich for a production of Jeremiah. We crossed the border at Bourges, and at the station buffet I was confronted by things I had almost forgotten. Oranges, bananas, good chocolate. There were French, Italian, and English newspapers, and no ration cards. On the Austrian side of town, men were still being sent from their homes to kill and be killed. Men on the Swiss side were sitting with their wives, smoking contentedly. The absurdity of war could not be more evident. Unthinkingly, I drank a black coffee and smoked a cigar. Heart palpitations followed. My body was not prepared for real coffee and tobacco. By staying neutral, the Swiss capital became the center of Europe. It was a meeting place for all intellectual movements, extreme opinions of every shade. Groups formed and dispersed, journals were printed, some sought to resolve conflicts, others to intensify them. There were 2 French newspapers, and I came to know the writers Jouve and Arcos. We became close friends immediately, as usually only happens in youth. We knew what was happening 5 hours away when a Frenchman and an Austrian caught sight of one another. We chose not to be furtive. We did not want to give the impression of doing things we thought unpermitted. There was no law forbidding our meeting, but we were being watched and reported on. Because the charge of trafficking with the enemy was considered treason, we would not share cigarettes, even a match. Other than that, I could talk more freely with these pacifists in their language than I could with most of my countrymen. We few, we happy few. We band of brothers. At first it was liberating to be in Zurich. At night I walked for hours through the streets and on the banks of the lake, breathing the fresh air. It seemed you could sense there were no wives or mothers lying awake behind the windows, sleepless through worry. I saw no wounded or maimed men, no men counting days until they would be loaded into trains. You could feel justified in being alive. I never again met such a variety of impassioned people. You quickly realized you could not be sure who to trust with all the propagandists, profiteers, and spies. In this milieu, mediocrities could become more important than they would ever be again. There was Henri Guilbeault, the Lissauer of the anti-war movement. I grew bored of endless discussions dividing people into categories: radical, liberal, Bolshevist, socialist, anarchist. I came to recognize the professional revolutionaries who raise themselves from insignificance by opposing everything. How much easier it is to create dogma than effective policy. To maintain clarity of thought, I chose to withdraw to Rüschlikon, half an hour away. Apart from the Russians, none of these coffee house conspirators would ever conspire beyond the coffee house or fulfill their improvised identities as international politicians. In Rüschlikon, I need only see my true friends, with none truer than Roland. Then the Americans entered the war. It could not last much longer. And then finally there was jubilation in the streets once more. Enemy soldiers embraced. Hell lay behind us. What could make us fear now? We believed this war must be the end of war. We trusted President Wilson's grand program. There was never such credulity. We were foolish, I know. It was not a logical decision to return to Austria. On the map, the country was reduced to a grey shadow of the former empire. The factories that generated wealth were now in foreign lands. The nation's gold reserves were seized, and yet we still had huge war debt. Our neighbor states did not want a share of this economic hardship. Austrians wanted to stay in the old Union or form a new one with Germany, but the Allies would not allow Germany to gain land from defeat. I do not know if it had ever happened before that a country was forced to be independent against its will. Independent Austria was to be a mutilated torso. I had been little used to my country in war and felt it my duty to be there in peacetime. As the author of Jeremiah, I had a responsibility in overcoming our defeat. The journey home called for the kind of preparations you would make for the North Pole. I knew there was no coal, no oil, no bread. You had every shoe we sold, brought as much food and clothing as possible, and insured it all, because the luggage carriages might be looted. Changing trains at the Swiss border once more. I was far from sure this was a good decision. I heard a bell announcing a train from the Austrian side. The policemen stood to attention and the border guards came out from their shelters. I noticed an old lady dressed in black with her 2 daughters. From her costume and bearing, she was a member of the nobility. She kept dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. A special train of black saloon cars rolled into the station onto the track in front of me. There, beyond the plate glass window, stood Emperor Karl. He had refused to abdicate, but here he was, forced into exile, taking a last look at his birthright. I thought of the grand occasions where I had seen his father in glittering uniforms. The word emperor had been the quintessence of power and majesty. With a jolt, the locomotive fired. The officials seemed uncertain if they should salute as the train slowly started away. The Austrian monarchy of nearly 1,000 years went with it. I changed to an Austrian train. The leather straps for opening the windows had been cut off. Every scrap of leather was valuable. Chunks of upholstery had gone the same. Ashtrays had been stolen for their nickel and copper. The poor quality coal was blown through broken windows, leaving black marks. It took 4 hours for a journey that should take 1. When darkness came, you realized there were no light bulbs. In that darkness, people clutched onto their valuables. They struck matches when they needed to see, sometimes to check their belongings. On arrival, there were no porters at the station. A few ragged soldiers offered their help. I found a cab. The horse was so old and malnourished I had not the heart to add more weight to his burden. With misgivings, I left my things in the luggage office. None of this was symbolic. It was a new reality. I had bought a house in Salzburg during the war. This was before the summer festivals made it popular. It was on a wooded hill, inaccessible by car, reached by 100 steps. The view of the Alpine panorama repaid you your trouble. You could see as far as Berchtesgaden. I had been unable to resist this old house with its grand facade. It proved as impractical as it was romantic. Rain was leaking through the roof, and carpenters had no timber, nor plumbers lead. We covered the worst holes with felt. When it snowed, there was no option but to climb the roof myself and shovel it away before it came through. Nobody would deliver to the house. The worst was the cold, because coal was unavailable. I did most of my work from my bed, fingers turning blue. After writing each page, I put them back under the covers. Each foray down to the city was a distressing experience. Beer was yellow water. Chocolate was sandy. Bread was black crumbs tasting of glue. People trapped rabbits and shot squirrels to remember the taste of meat. A well-fed cat or dog that ventured far from home rarely returned. Men went around in old uniforms, some Russian, retrieved from hospitals and morgues, clothes in which others had died. These were a more elegant choice than the trousers made from old sacks. It was deeply upsetting to see the yellow, dangerous eyes of the starving, to see what famine is. Generosity could not solve the problem. There was simply not enough food to go round. People in the countryside had it better. No farmer would dream of selling butter or eggs at the fixed rates. They would wait for someone to make them an offer. Men went from farm to farm with rucksacks buying food at illegal prices. Then they sold it in the towns for 4 times, 5 times. The farmers were delighted with their fattening wallets. Then they went into town and found what they wanted had risen in price 10 times. They reconsidered. Now they would only accept barter. Inflation accelerated. Prices shot up at random. A box of matches could cost 20 times in one shop as next door. The less greedy shopkeeper's reward was to see his stock cleared out in minutes. Soon no one knew what anything cost. Grotesque trading spread to Austria. In a farmhouse you could find a statue of the Buddha staring at you, or a Rococo bookcase with leather-bound French works. The new owners would direct your attention to their books they could not read. Genuine leather, France. Back in town you would think the Catholic Church changed its stance on divorce. So many people stopped wearing wedding rings. Usually the husband's disappeared first, then his wife's. People stopped spending coins, even that copper or nickel represented real value, more real than printed paper. To replace the coins, each town began printing emergency currency. Eventually each village too. This would not be accepted even in the next village. This lasted 3 long years as the chaos worsened. Cordons were set up on the borders of provinces to reduce black market trading. The response was nocturnal transportation, or bribery of officials with hungry children at home. Sometimes there were pitched battles with knives and revolvers like the Wild West. There were absurd consequences to all this. The new virtues were to be adaptable and unscrupulous. The patriotic man who saved for 40 years and invested in war bonds went bankrupt. The frivolous man who had amassed debt was absolved. Then the government banned rent increases. siding with the majority of tenants against the minority of landlords. Soon the year's rent on an apartment was the same as a restaurant meal. In effect, the whole country lived rent-free for 5 to 10 years. I could vouch that for some time the Grand Hotel in Salzburg was booked up by the English working class. A few had discovered they could live more cheaply than in the slums back home, and more followed. They would never exchange their unemployment checks from pounds until they were ready to spend. Less amusing visitors descended on us. These vultures would buy up as much as possible with their strong currencies. It was with trepidation that I came home to Vienna for the return of the Philharmonic. We poured our way through darkened streets to buy tickets with worthless banknotes. What would have bought a box for a year bought a seat in the back of the gallery. The signs were not encouraging. Inside the hall the only heat came from lamps, scarcely emitting enough light. It looked dismal, a bad dream of the past. No evening dress, no colour, no radiance. Just a crowd of worn-out people in worn-out coats, too cold to remove them. The musicians entered. We knew them all, yet hardly recognized them. Nothing had escaped emaciation. The Vienna Philharmonic was a mass of spectres in threadbare tails. It broke our hearts to know they were taking home less than a waiter. Thousands and thousands of people were living like this. Then the conductor raised his baton, and then there was sound. And it was more wonderful than ever. I was awestruck. I think we all were, even the sound makers on the stage. The music found life in us, and we found life in the music. We were tired people. We knew our roads were crumbling. Our empire was gone. We knew the musicians had refused offers from other orchestras, better offers in unneglected places. Nobody knew if coal would keep being delivered, if even tomorrow they could open the theatre. If tonight is the last night, make it unforgettable. It was. The music was the heat, the music was the light, the music was the life force. Never was the will to live so strong. Never did the orchestra play better. They were our last line of defense against barbarity. In our seats pressed together for warmth, we showered them with applause, pleading for more. We still had our honor, our glory, the Philharmonic of Vienna. With all my will, I cannot remember how we managed in those years, when every day we all had to raise tens of thousands just to survive. I would have predicted women buying groceries would quickly reach their wits' end. I would have thought life would be reduced to the mere business of survival, theatres and concert halls deserted. But it continued, almost unchanged. The mysterious fact was that we did manage. Somehow we managed. With the money in your pocket holding no value, people valued all the more their work, friendship, love, art, nature. There was such intensity in the chaos. I never worked with more concentration. Life itself was at stake. The more intensely we lived, the more we kept disaster at bay. Slowly, conditions began to consolidate, some kind of order returned, and to our surprise, the independent Austria still stood. I cannot remember when I first heard the name of Adolf Hitler, but it must have been early because I was 2.5 hours from his base in Munich. There were many agitators calling for a putsch in Germany. They rose to attention and just as swiftly disappeared. If an acquaintance from Munich tells me about a troublemaker there, why would it occupy my thoughts? I never anticipated that a man I became aware of like that would one day become someone I would be forced to think of each day, if indeed I ever stopped thinking about the one who has brought such misery. When his name rose in 23, it was because his putsch had failed and he was arrested and jailed. After that, no one thought of him as a potential force, if they ever had. In that decade, peace seemed to prevail. That counted for a great deal. Germany was received into the League of Nations on honourable terms. Britain disarmed. Mussolini undertook to protect Austria. Loans encouraged economic reconstruction. The world seemed to want to rebuild. Progress returned. You could dream again and hope for a united Europe. In these years, something I never really expected came to me. Success. I suppose it began modestly with Jeremiah, and it just kept growing. I would be lying if I said I was indifferent to it. It pleased me a great deal, even if I don't claim to be the most important of writers. What I valued was having a faithful following who trusted me and awaited my work. Of course, this trust was something I must not disappoint. The success enabled me to live as I liked. I could travel as the author Stefan Zweig and be admitted to all the fancy places, or I could choose otherwise, for my face is not well known. This was my preference. I relished traveling anonymously as in my youth, carrying a famous name in my wallet, keeping it to myself. I think now of the hundreds of thousands, I suppose millions of books with that name printed then in Germany and Austria. None of them can be sold or bought today. Surely many of them must still be on bookshelves, hidden perhaps, but still sitting there. One of those journeys, Stefan Zweig took me to the new Russia. In the summer of 28, I was invited to Moscow for Tolstoy's centenary. I eagerly accepted this apolitical opportunity. I had been planning to visit in 1914 for my book on Dostoevsky. Then, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia became the most fascinating country by far. With the propaganda and counter-propaganda both ferocious, it was difficult to know the truth. We knew it was an experiment that could determine the future of the world. Many who knew little enthusiastically admired or fanatically hated it. I passed through the Russian countryside for the first time. The towns with their onion domes, the little huts, the wide empty steppes with a melancholy aura, the women in bright-coloured headscarves and white aprons, and men with long beards who greeted us with broad smiles. It was so familiar from the masterpieces of their literature. In the towns there were crowds of people everywhere in shops, outside theatres, and they all had to wait. Nothing quite went to plan. The new bureaucracy was enjoying itself, writing memos and permits. Time ran through your fingers. Everything was delayed. Western Europeans were sure to arrive an hour early for every appointment. What moved me was the people and their impulsive goodwill. When they showed you the least little thing, their eyes shone. We made that. And the whole nation identified with we. A cab driver, unprompted, would point at some new building, grinning broadly. Ours. They felt sure a better day was coming, so they put up with the deprivations and restrictions. The old sense of inferiority was reversed. Now they would show Europe the way. They were convinced this was a great endeavour for humanity. I often found myself smiling politely in ordinary factories. "Look, electric," a worker would say, flicking a switch, expecting me to break into wonder. Because the Russians were seeing these things for the first time, they thought them invented in the revolution. Praise be to Lenin and Trotsky. The Hermitage Museum impressed me, and I do not forget the sight of workmen, soldiers, and peasants tramping with heavy shoes through imperial halls. Hats held reverently, they looked at the pictures with pride, as if saying, "This belongs to us, and we will learn to understand it." To become educated was their duty and their honour. Then one evening I returned home after a fine party. Only in my hotel room was I really alone. Foreigners were accompanied, carried along on waves of friendliness. I will admit I was close to making paeans of praise to this new world. The enthusiasm was infectious. I took off my coat. I felt something crackle inside. A letter in French. It had not arrived by post, and it wasn't signed. Someone in the party had slipped it into my pocket. The writer was clever and humane, bitterly critical of the curtailment of liberty. "Don't believe everything they tell you," wrote my correspondent. "Whatever you are shown, don't forget what you don't see. The people who talk to you only say what they are allowed." After that, the more I saw, the less I felt sure what it meant. I think of a conversation I had with Lunacharsky at that centenary. He said, "We Russians are impatient souls. We want to know the truth, every truth, and we want it now." Tolstoy was a real Russian. He looked at thousands of years of history and wished it change in the blink of an eye. Just like us now, and with a single prescription again, just like now. And I think also of how that old man tormented himself in his quest. My years passed in work and travel, reading, writing, learning. I enjoyed these pleasures. There was a custom in Austria for celebrating a writer's 50th birthday. Mine was in 1931. It was a bad day for the postman coming up my steps. My publisher printed a bibliography of all my published work, the editions from every language. This was a book in itself. I went through it. Bulgarian, Armenian, Chinese, Marathi, Finnish. My work had reached readers in Braille, readers of all kinds of languages I would never understand. It was translated into exotic characters and idioms. My wish to express myself in work of some merit had been granted beyond my wildest imaginings. I was free of care, the future was assured. With hard work and good fortune, I had won back the sense of security lost in the war. I remember thinking that I wanted for nothing, and wondering if that was for the best. There is a strange yearning in the artistic soul, perhaps the human soul. When life is hard, we long for peace. When it comes, we miss the turmoil. I remember a strange foreboding that a man who wants for nothing has everything to lose. In retrospect, we see those post-war years averted radical upheaval only on the surface. A huge revolution took place in the minds of people. Many lives were lost in that war, and many beliefs. The Kaiser had sworn to fight to the last breath drawn by man and horse. In the end, he chose to flee his land under cover of night. The Germans did away with monarchy, that much was visible. But what of their generals and politicians and leaders? For 4 years, murder and robbery was committed in the name of heroism. What of the old moral commandments? What of the ties that bind? The younger generation looked scornfully at their fathers, men like me who had foreseen nothing, who had allowed themselves to be deprived of both peace and victory. None of these young people believed their parents, teachers, politicians. Every state decree or newspaper report was read with distrust. Was it not understandable? They turned their back on all tradition, determined to take fate in their hands. Anything or anyone from before was done for. The fundamental feeling was that life must be different. A new time, a better world. Wasn't that what we wanted in youth? We sensed we had no right to condemn them. A period of wild experimentation began. Attempts to overtake the past in a single bound. The younger you were and the less you knew, all the better, for you were freer. The easily understood became poorly esteemed. Melody in music, likeness in painting, clarity in language. The definite article was omitted, sentence structure reversed. Everything was written in abbreviated telegraphese, with the addition of excitable exclamations. Literature was discarded that was not activist, meaning based on political theory. Serious music strove for atonality. Architecture turned buildings inside out. In dance, the rage was for Cuban rhythms. This was the golden age of all that was unknown and exotic. Anthroposophy, spiritualism, occultism, theosophy, Eastern mysticism and Paracelsian mysticism. There was palm reading. There was somnambulism. Normality and moderation was rejected. The theater showcased incest and patricide. Extremes of communism and fascism dominated discussion. What was wanted was temptation, emancipation, revelation. Suddenly there was morphine, cocaine, heroin. I would not like to have missed that chaotic time. In its fierce frenzy, it cleared the air of defunct traditions, discharging years of tension. The audacious experiments produced ideas that will endure. But as an old man in his 40s, I watched with detachment. It was tragicomic the way intellectuals followed suit with desperate haste, panic-stricken at being outdated. Grey-haired painters added cubes and dice to unwanted still lifes. Privy councillors lectured on Karl Marx. Court ballerinas contorted half-naked to Schoenberg's Verklärte Nacht. It was in Germany where this went furthest. After the inflation in Austria, hyperinflation came and knocked next door. Nothing made the Germans so bitter as this, so ripe for hatred. Yes, they had lost the war, but it was a war fought hard on 2 fronts, with plenty of victories. Nothing could mitigate or justify the destruction of the economy. It was worse in Austria and coincided with cultural chaos. Seeing their money slipping through their fingers, the Germans now applied their efficient natures to the cause of perversion. I do not know when there was last such an ecstasy of madness. State decrees were laughed out of court, morals were thrown overboard. Berlin was the worst sink of iniquity. Every shop seemed to be a bar, and below every bar, a dive bar. Girls cut their hair in bobs and men shaved their beards so you could not tell them apart. Young girls, far too young, boasted of adventures. The more salacious, the better. Homosexuality was not simply permitted, it became the fashion. Youths in wasp-waisted coats, faces made up, promenaded the Kurfürstendamm. Financiers courted drunken sailors in darkened corners. Not since ancient times were there such orgies as the Berlin balls, men in women's clothing and vice versa. The outstanding feature of this eroticism was its pretense. It was impossible not to notice the country was unhappy. Those nice girls drinking spirits with their hair slicked back would have been smiling more authentically with hot chocolate and apple cake. It could feel like the end of times, and many who lived through those embittering years sensed there would be a reaction, a backlash, waiting in the wings were the counter-revolutionaries. It could have been their motto, the worse things get, the better for us. It seemed the orderly Germans did not know what to do with liberty. Secretly they came to hate their new republic, not because it might suppress the wildness, but because it allowed it. Part of them began looking for someone to take liberty away. In doing so, they would again summon their own killers. Political strife continued in Germany. The inflation crisis was replaced by the banking crisis, then the unemployment crisis, and all this topped by the indifference of the world. Hitler resurfaced. Even Goethe once wrote he hated disorder more than injustice, and the man loudly promising order now found hundreds of thousands of supporters. We intellectuals were blind to the danger. Those of us who read his book didn't know whether to laugh more at his politics or his prose. It was impossible that a man who left school a failure could aspire to positions held by Prince Bulow or von Bismarck. Even when he became Chancellor on that winter day in 1933, the vast majority who opposed him still thought it would be a brief episode, and on that basis some of them helped him into the position. After the Reichstag fire, refugees began arriving in Austria, swimming the river or climbing the mountains at night. I saw some of the first. It was already as though we well-rested, well-to-do Austrians were alien to them. Starving, ragged and distressed, they just stared at us. When I met the gaze of their pale faces, I still did not guess this was my future staring back at my present. It is strange to remember how one can know and not know at the same time. Around then I told my publisher it would not be long before my books were banned in Germany. He was astonished. Stefan Zweig, who had never dabbled in politics or written a word criticizing our neighbor. The prediction soon came true, yet I was still not contemplating 1/100th of the cresting wave. I was in Vienna during those historic days of February 1934, the suicide of Austrian independence. On the first day I had a meeting at a cafe in the Ringstrasse. On my way, men in makeshift uniforms holding guns asked me where I was going. I explained, and they let me pass. I had no idea what they were doing. That evening I tried to pay the bill at my hotel before returning to Salzburg. The clerk asked me if I would be staying longer because the railways were on strike. The next day the paper had vague reports of trouble in the suburbs. Unable to travel, I walked to the library. The shops were open as usual, and inside students were studying. Only on the third day did reports begin to emerge. After it was really all over. On the fourth day I came back to Salzburg. A couple of acquaintances I met bombarded me with questions about what had happened. Artillery had been fired, buildings occupied, hundreds of men killed. I never saw a thing. I was a disappointing witness to the Civil War. The best I could tell them was to buy a French newspaper. It did not take long for the next reality to catch up with me. The first morning back in Salzburg, I was woken early by 4 police officers at my door. They said they had a warrant to search for weapons of the Republican Schutzbund. It was so absurd I was speechless. Stefan Zweig, who had never dabbled in politics. Not only was I an unlikely suspect, but a house on a hill visible for miles is an unlikely hideaway. I had to let them in. It was obvious from the casual search that they did not believe it warranted. Searching my house showed nobody was above suspicion. After a 30-minute search they left, and I realized I would never like my house as before. Personal liberty is everything to me. And I thought of Shakespeare's words. So foul a sky clears not without a storm. 2 days later, I took my most important things and travelled to England. 30 years earlier, I had felt like a stranger in London. I was made to feel tedious because of my indifference to sport, politics, and gambling. I understood that one horse can run faster than another, but I could not understand why it mattered so much which would run fastest, nor why men would stake on this their incomes, and seemingly their reputations. On arrival, the grey fog was the same as before, as was the damp atmosphere. I quickly felt incredibly at ease. Once again I was in a courteous, calm, and civil society. It was an escape from hostility, tension, constant arguments about what must be done. The British were still content with their gardens and little hobbies. There was room to breathe. I hesitate to say much about those years from 34 to 39. We all know what transpired. It was painful to watch the greatest virtue of the British abused by propaganda. Their honest wish to think well of others was never less timely. Hitler only had to mention the word peace for the papers to break out in jubilation. and the conscience of the world had grown tired. It could only murmur a little. As time passed, the more I avoided the news and even conversation. I lived anonymously in a small flat. I saw the inevitable, but I was a guest in a foreign land. I refrained from being outspoken. Forget it all, I told myself. Nobody can take away the best part of your life, the part already lived. Escape into your mind and your work, a place where reason still has value. Forget you are a citizen of a state, a piece in an infernal game. Stay in the place where you are your living, breathing self. I remember going into a London travel agent to find it full of Jewish refugees. The most pessimistic had escaped Germany in 33 or 34, when there were still ways to take your possessions, your wealth. By 1938 you were lucky to escape with your life. You had to beg at the consulates at the border, usually in vain. Few countries want the destitute. The true optimists stayed and would make the journey to the ghettos and the concentration camps. Inside this office was a man so old and tired I did not recognize him at first. He had once been a rich Viennese industrialist, a most discerning art collector. I asked him where he wanted to go. I don't know, how can I think what I want anymore? Someone had told him he might get a visa to Santo Domingo. Watching him queue wrung my heart. Any form of emigration like this upsets your equilibrium. I wondered as he held the table for support what he had left to believe in. His greatest hope was a place on a map he had never before wished to spend a day. Perhaps the most tragic part was that modernity had already taken what bound these people. Their ancestors knew for what they suffered, a special mission with a great destiny. The queuers had little faith in God and little cause to renew it. Standing, waiting, seeking passage to anywhere, their identity was simply a burden. They were more German, Austrian, or Russian than Jewish. They looked at one another with burning eyes. Why me? Why you? Why you and me together when I don't know you? Job's eternal question to God hung in the air. Why have you made me your target? I kept returning to Vienna to see my mother. In November 37 I made a trip in a hurry, feeling it would be the last time. My friends there laughed at my premonition. Didn't I realize the nation was completely behind the fatherland front? But I knew the voices calling Heil Schuschnigg today would be calling Heil Hitler tomorrow. The majority always swaps sides with the seesaw of power. I could not get my friends to understand or understand them. Perhaps they were wiser after all. They did not start suffering until disaster struck. I had the agony of my imagination, then the fresh torture of seeing it realized. There was a desperate farewell on my lips as I walked the familiar streets, taking in each favorite view. I embraced my mother with the same secret knowledge. Never again. On the train I passed Salzburg, where I had lived 20 years. From the carriage window was a view of my house on the hill. I did not look up. I owed nothing to that silhouette worth the pain of more parting. If I thought I could detach my emotions from my homeland's fate, I was deluded. When news broke of negotiations over Austria between Britain and Germany, my hand shook as I held it. The negotiations would count for nothing. What counted was tanks and jackboots, and they came with swastikas. There were no more Austrian passports, and I had to apply for a substitute, a white document for a stateless person. This seemed unimportant. In my younger reveries I had thought what a fine thing to be stateless, how in accordance with my feelings to owe no obligation anywhere, for that reason to belong everywhere. Yet again I was forced to realize how inadequate the imagination. After some time in a waiting room, I was admitted to the relevant British office. Not until that moment did I really understand how it would feel. One day I was a foreign gentleman paying taxes on international money. The next I was a refugee. I was placed in a not dishonorable but diminished category. My passport was exchanged for a document calling me an alien. Now I must request a visa for every journey. A Russian exile's words came back to me. A man used to need only a body and a soul. Now he needs a passport. We dreamt of a century of liberty and internationalism. Instead, we have studied regulations like doctorate students. I regard every stamp in my passport as a brand. This is pettiness, I know it. But if we do not record what was lost, we will never find it again. Before 1914, the earth belonged to the human race. You could go where you want and stay as long as you liked. Traveling as far as America and India, I never set eyes on a passport. You boarded your transport and got off without asking or being asked questions. No permits or visas. Borders were nothing but notions on a map. You crossed them unknowingly. Xenophobia was a symptom of our intellectual epidemic. Humiliations devised for criminals inflicted on every traveller. To be photographed, fingerprints, evidence of invitations and addresses of friends. It costs time, and time is irretrievable. Perhaps there comes a moment in every man's life when he sees his father in himself. How he would have hated to be searched and questioned while going about his business. The only thing I ever heard him boast about was that his name had never been seen on a loan. His pride came from never needing anything from anyone, that he said please or thank you from politeness, never from necessity. Self-sufficiency meant more to him than any show of wealth. He lived in an apartment and he travelled second class. Anyone who spent so much as half his income, he thought a hedonist. I think back to his world in which I grew up. It was the golden age of security, everything built to last, every duty defined. Everyone knew what was allowed and what was not. If you had wealth, you could work out years ahead how much interest it would earn. Ducat coins were minted in solid gold, immutable value you held in your hand. Civil servants knew when they would be promoted and when they would retire. Can anyone truly enjoy the present without the future assured? My father took the epoch's creed as his own. Safety first. I cannot remember seeing him run up a staircase or do anything in haste. Haste was bad form, a sign of lost control. Ambitious young people in frock coats did anything to distance themselves from the taint of immaturity. Age was an advantage. Adverts promised methods to thicken your beard. Young doctors bought gold-rimmed glasses with clear lenses. Grey hair dye would have been a lucrative invention. It is telling of the time that by his cautious methods my father gradually became rich, and then very rich. Despite this, he never once ate at Sacher's. Not because of economy, he dined at the other great hotels. It was his respect for traditional privilege, because at Sacher's it would be unseemly to sit at the next table to Prince Schwarzenberg, because my father was an industrialist, because he was Jewish, because the prince may not like it, but even if the prince had invited him, my father would not have liked it. He would not have liked it, and he would not have gone. Perhaps it doesn't make sense. He took pride in not eating at the best restaurant in Vienna. He was proud of it, because that was proper. It doesn't make sense, except it did make sense. Ah, you wouldn't understand. You're too young. If it was only a delusion my father lived, it was a noble and wonderful delusion, more humane than anything today. And something in me cannot shake it off, despite all I know and all my disappointments. It is one of those sad facts that what took 1,000 years to build could be destroyed in 20, or was it 5, or less. Those shots that rang out in Sarajevo on June 28th shattered my world of security into 1,000 pieces, as if it was a hollow pot just waiting to break. Those shots which disturbed the people of Austria for little more than an hour, then disturbed them for how long? For many for the rest of their lives. Of Vienna today I can hardly speak. I know little of what is happening. I am fearful of interpreting it. There must still be Mozart and Beethoven, and every perfect note that sounds out from the past must be a rebuke of the present. I think of my last days in Vienna when the people were so relaxed, and I was not. When I was perturbed by their light-hearted attitude, the old jouissance. It is strange to be disturbed by the familiar, discomforted by home comforts. To walk inside your own front door and feel like an intruder. I found I had lost faith in the spirit of my upbringing. And then when my mother died soon after, I felt no grief. A son should grieve his mother, yes, so he should live in different times. I had spent my grief in advance and found no more. I felt relief. The relief she would be free from further suffering. That she died at home in her apartment. You have to understand, she was an optimist. I could have told you about conversations with Hauptmann, Schnitzler, Pirandello, or the great premieres, Mahler's 10th Symphony, the sight of Dzerzhinsky dancing. Great art can help heal wounds, but it doesn't stop bullets. I remember coming across an old-school textbook and seeing it was little more than a history of battles. Those who won wars were men of destiny. Statesmen who preserved peace were of little interest. In youth we thrilled to Alexander the Great more than the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius. If history is to have meaning, we must recognize our mistakes to overcome them. But in the age of mass emotion, we see how few even try. Perhaps to truly live you must see war and peace, rise and fall, the light and the dark. Knowledge is not given freely. You pay the price in full. When war came again, I traveled here to South America. Europe passed its death sentence. The cradle of Western civilization, my sacred home, is a broken acropolis. Yet again the past is over. All achievements count for nothing. Something else will begin, but after how much hell, how many purgatories? I think of Shakespeare. Let us withdraw and meet time as it seeks us. On the 25th of February, 1942, Stefan Zweig and his wife, Lotte Altmann, were given a state funeral in Rio de Janeiro, the then capital of Brazil.